Welcome to Interwoven, a podcast where we follow the winding threads of literature as they weave together stories and voices across time and cultures. Hi everyone, welcome back to Interwoven. I'm your host Azka, and today I'm joined by Laura Moulton. She's a writer, educator, and the founder of the nonprofit organization Street Books. Street Books is an organization that provides marginalised communities or communities found at the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, with books and resources, primarily in the form of a mobile street library. Alongside Ben Hodgson, she's the co-writer of a memoir, Loners, The Making of a Street Library, which was published in 2021. She's currently taken a step back from Street Books and is teaching at the Attic Institute, and I'm so glad that she's agreed to be on this podcast and that she's taken out the time to be here with us. Laura, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for finding me in the world, Azka, and for this invitation. It's a real privilege to talk to you.
Oh, yeah, that's one of the great things about a podcast. You get to talk to people from all over the world, and that's what makes it really exciting. And I guess we'll just start at the beginning. So I know that Street Books initially started off as an art project, and it's currently quite a well-established nonprofit, and I wondered what that journey looked like, what inspired you to create it.
Yeah, I have been a longtime fan of books and also bicycles, and so I think both of those things were in me already. But the several years that led up to the founding of Street Books, I was doing sort of strange participatory art projects, in the community. And the project that I did right before Street Books was this giant rolling gallery that had little plexiglass windows and featured precious objects from Portland State University students, which I had sort of solicited. Um, and so those were on display, and I invited people to sit down and use these beautiful antique typewriters to type about their precious objects. And so that was the thing I did right before Street Books. And I think when Street Books came around, it was initially this idea of books on the street and what would it be like to have a library that moved around the city. And then I think gradually I began to think about what would it be like if the people who are rarely invited to participate in cool art projects, who go unnoticed, who may not access the mainstream library because they lack photo ID or proof of address because they have no address. Um, it began to take shape in that way, and I thought this would be a great experiment to see if that was a useful service to people and if they wanted to participate in something like that. So I wrote a grant, and the great thing about getting grant funding is that you have to take the idea that's been floating around with you for a while and actually do something. They sort of call you on your, aspirational bullshit sort of thing. And um, so that was very cool, and it forced me to kind of create the terms. And I really do think that I wrote a compelling vision of what it could look like. I described rolling up and setting up the library, and I think the judges probably felt like it would be monstrous to get in the way of that service or whatever. So I got it. So that three that first 3 months I set out knowing far less than I should have. I don't know how I could have researched better. I did bike around in the city and kind of study where people were sleeping out and chose a couple of spots. And I think that was a fairly informed, set of decisions. But I think very quickly I realized that I had assumed a lot in setting this library up. I assumed what people might want to read. I tried to be pretty diverse in my curation. I used my grandfather's Louis L'Amour Westerns. I pulled murder mysteries and more literary sort of highbrow stuff. I tried to start with a mix of good stuff. But what I found after 3 months, and I write about this in Loners, the book that I co-wrote with my friend Hodge, is that once I was out there and once people understood that the project was for them and they didn't need money to interact with it and to benefit from it and take a book, it became a well-established little system and little library and its own kind of portal, so that by the end of August, when I thought I was going to neatly wrap up this project, I realized, there was a man named Keith who came, checked out two new books, turned in his other two, and said, "See you next week." And I just realized to my horror, there was no place for Keith if I didn't stay running. And so by then I had a couple of really stellar volunteers. We ran a Kickstarter campaign to make a bit of money to stay going through the fall. And I never imagined that almost 16 years later, it would still be going and be a vibrant sort of presence in the city and a needed service and community for people. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a sketch of how it all began.
Yeah, it's so powerful, especially in, I guess, today's world where you see sort of the rise of anti-intellectualism and censorship of books, and to have a more free sort of platform where reading and where books are sort of encouraged and promoted is I think really really powerful, and is only going to become even more powerful over time. And I'm wondering if you have any particularly memorable customers who've really challenged or changed your views of certain books or pieces of literature, and if there are
Yeah.
any books that people or customers tend to come back to that seem to be like a favorite.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I described this anecdote in the book Loners, but Ben Hodgson, aka Hodge, strolled up that first summer and inspected my selection of books, and after a minute said, "Where's your PG Wodehouse? What kind of self-respecting librarian doesn't have Wodehouse?" And I said at the time, "I've heard of Wodehouse, but I've never read him." And Hodge just shook his head in disgust, and then he came back the next week, and he likes to say that he set the record for most checkouts that summer, read like 50 books, which I think is a record. And he also likes to say that he's been with the outfit since the beginning, but he just started on the other side of the counter.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was in all outside for like 3.5 years during a period of time where he was coping with mental health issues. And he's now indoors in an apartment, and we began to write that book several years into our friendship. And he became a really important part of Street Books. He's on the board of directors. He ran his own library shift for years, and now he volunteers. He's not really got his own library shift because his health has not been wonderful this past year or two. But Hodge was an early example to me of someone who kind of blew my mind. He was far better read than I was. And so whatever misconceptions I may have had as I set out on a bike library, Hodge reminded me, and many others reminded me, that they could talk to me about books in a way that was very humbling to me. I'm trying to think, there were really interesting characters all along. Some that, or there was a man named Mark who asked for books on champions, books
Mm.
that were examples of people overcoming challenges. And he checked out Seabiscuit, the book about the racehorse, kind of underdog racehorse, and just talked about how here's a horse that no one saw the value of, that was sort of disposable, and then he reached his full potential and he was heroic. And I think that those kinds of examples and those kinds of conversations were really moving on the street library. And I also remember at the corner of Fourth and Burnside in Portland, there was an encampment that was a sort of rest village that people set up cooperatively, that for years slept like 60 to 70 people each night. You could see blue tarps. It was definitely a pain in the city's, uh, but because it was a very visible sign of the way it was not looking after all of its citizenry. And I remember hearing this conversation between a guy named Mark and a passerby who was not connected at all with the Rest Village, but just paused, about their favorite book. And the book that they were talking about was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Oh wow.
And they were debating who the real monster in that book is, And I just remember thinking, like, I am experiencing the conversation you'd expect in a college upper level, literature class. And I think that I had those moments often, which reminded me that I had still come with a set of assumptions about what people might want to read, about what they might, the caliber of their conversations. And that was another very humbling thing. It didn't take me long to realize that I kept having my ideas blown apart in the best possible way. And so those are a few things that come to mind. Yeah.
That actually reminds me of a recent discovery that was made, and it's a book called Caliban Shrieks by Jack Hilton. And
Oh, wow.
it was written in the 1930s by someone who was homeless and unemployed after being enlisted on the army. And
Mm.
he wrote quite a modernist, fragmented piece of work that I still haven't had the chance to read to, and it's been on my list for so long. But I've heard such good things about it, and it was only discovered like last year.
Oh,
And it
wow.
was a mix between sort of modernist stream of consciousness and more personal autobiography. And I think it's really revived like this interest in how it is that people we may not always assume to have that level of literary taste, as you mentioned, have are actually coming into sort of established literary canons. And that leads me on to my next question, which is whether sort of your experience as part of street books has changed the way you view what how literature is written for certain people, and whether that's even true anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting question, right? Like, I think that, I mean, I think when we consider our audience and we consider who art is for, who literature is for, a project like Street Books offers an opportunity for people to kind of completely rejigger their thinking. And I think that that is something that we heard very early on. People saying, wait, homeless people read books? There was that first initial kind of reaction. And I think that once they had sort of, you know, reframed that or sort of thought that through, then they were open to the stories that we had, which, in one case, Hodge called me after a shift one day and said, "You're going to love this. A guy today didn't want Nietzsche, not because he didn't want to read Nietzsche, but because it was the wrong translation." And
Wow.
that had blown Hodge's mind, and Hodge had been out on the streets for some years. And it certainly rearranged mine. And I think that one of the powerful things about street books has been by showing up for so many years, now 5 days a week. There are library shifts. We have 3 bicycles, 2 librarians per shift. We got a sense of what people wanted to read. We got a sense of this audience. Hodge calls the library sort of the ultimate community college, which is, you know, ground level, free, at the street, available to anyone, especially people who would otherwise not be welcomed into institutions necessarily. So I think that that's been a really fascinating study. What people want, what they're willing to do when they are part of a community and it's clear they're welcome. It's a pretty radical thing.
Yeah, you've mentioned community, and in your opinion, what would a truly inclusive library system actually look like? How is it that sort of these established institutions need to change or evolve over time?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. I think, Portland, Oregon is one of the West Coast cities in the United States, like many others, that is really struggling with taking good care of people. And there are more people living outside than there have been in maybe our history, I think. Certainly in the history of street books and what I've seen in terms of numbers. But I think that our library system, our county library system, has really tried to adapt. They have a
Mm-hmm.
full-time social worker at the central library. They have a coffee hour, and they try to take good care of people. I've witnessed a ton of people coming in with their belongings and sitting in a chair, and then the librarians, really trying to work with everyone. And so I really appreciate that. But I will say that there is something powerful about being outside institution. not taking any federal money. So when Trump came back into office here, we were not expressly threatened, at least financially. I don't think he loves the idea of an organization like Street Books. It's just a hunch. But I think that I remember one time a Multnomah County librarian coming to visit the Street Books headquarters and look at our systems because she wanted to help establish a system and library at one of the safe rest villages. So basically, people living in kind of small pods inside a community, sort of an emergency kind of transition back into to housing, to an apartment, whatever. And I think she came in and her stress about the whole thing was, how do you set up a card catalog? How do you set up, an inventory and track it coming and going? And I think visiting our library and our headquarters and our storage and then seeing our operations kind of blew her mind because I just said, we don't, we keep a loose inventory of what's most popular and we make sure and keep that going, but we do not the exchange with each patron includes signing out on a card the title and their name. And that does not go to some larger system. Like we want books to be out in the streets and we do not wait for them to come back. And the cool thing is we do have among our regular patrons, we have a robust rate of return. And that has not been a problem. But we also understand what people face when they live outside. In the rainy season in Portland is pretty legendary, and people come sometimes to find us to let us know why they are not able to return a book. So they take it seriously. I've had people also say, I don't know when I'm going to come back through Portland. I shouldn't take a book, and I had a kid one time coming through and he was going to the Rainbow Gathering in Washington State and he found a copy of the Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. And he said, I would love that so much, but I don't know when I'm going to come back through. And I was like, dude, if you're hopping a train tonight, you have to take this book. And so he did, and so I think that there is a freedom in inviting people to return the book if they're able to and passing it on to someone if they're not. And we get a huge bunch of donations. Portland is a very literary city. It's full of readers, and we get great donations. We also source our books used from Powell's Bookstore, which is an epic, giant, blocks-long bookstore in Portland, multi-stories. You have to take a map and a sandwich even to just navigate it. And we also support independent bookstores beyond Powell's. So we've been good. We've had a very good system, and we have not had to focus too much on inventory. And I just think that freedom and that invitation to participate and the celebration when a book does come back has been a really rich part of the project.
Well, as a university student, I've been looking at the reception of medieval texts and the annotations that we often find there. And I think that Street Books is so powerful because it's allowing us to retain that idea of books being passed on, and it's always so fun to be able to receive books and then to send them on. And I'm wondering if you've ever sort of encountered annotations in any of the books you've gotten back, or sort of notes or like fun things like that.
Yeah, I would say weird ephemera sometimes, like maybe postcards. I don't know that we've gotten back too much in the way of marginalia or interaction on that level. In some ways, I think that is almost a luxury of someone who has good writing utensils and good shelter, But I also think, over time I think that probably donations that have come in with some of those, like an old letter or a postcard or an odd bookmark, things like that, I think come to mind. But I don't know that we've gotten too much in the way of returned books that have that. Very rarely. I mean, I took a book back once that seemed like it had maybe been steeped in some kind of, liquid for a while. But I don't think that's what you're after. I was impressed that the guy returned it. I mean, that meant a lot, even though it was no longer usable. But that's very rare. So.
And have you ever had to how do you ensure that your books and the curation of them is accessible? So have you ever had Braille books, for instance, or books that cater to sort of special needs.
Yeah, we've been able to provide a real wide variety. It's very important to us that people have their reflection and their identities, that they recognize themselves in the lineup. And so for that reason, there is a giant range of of books, and that includes books by authors of color, LGBTQ books, many of them banned. We try to prioritize displaying some banned books as a poke in the eye of the larger
Mm.
culture right now. But we also, I've had people request books, children's books, because they were working on reading. They had not had great opportunities with education, or they'd had an undiagnosed reading challenge. And so we have fielded a lot of requests over time. And that's one thing that's really exciting is we're able to offer people requests. So somebody might go down a rabbit hole of like Harry Potter and really desperately need, the third book in the series. And we're able to do that. I've also done language books, like immigrants learning English, for example, might
Mm.
request a Spanish language, Spanish English dictionary, or some adult basic education materials that allow them to kind of begin with some kind of foundational stuff. So that's been very cool. We do have a budget for books, and we're able to answer people's specific requests. And I think the powerful thing there is also someone comes up tentatively to the library, they suss it out, they figure out, okay, this is for me technically. They put in an order for a book. And when the librarian rolls up the next week and calls them by name and says, I have your book, like we've seen that transformation and realize the power of that. It's being recognized. It's having someone having kept you in mind and gone to get you something that week and provide it. And then it's very cool to be able to follow up the next week. I had a guy named Eligio at the Workers Center, which was a Spanish speaking shift, and he checked out a book in Spanish that was called Finding the Love of Your Life. And so each week I could check in with him, like, Eligio, did the book take? Like, how's it going? And he would say, not yet. But there was, so there's that level of camaraderie and kinship around books. And that's been a very cool bridge, really, to those relationships.
And I mean, nowadays you see a lot of people reading on things like Kindles or online, and has that shifted anything in street books, or has the power of physical books withstood this new current?
Yeah, I think that that's so interesting, and I'm actually completely obsessed right now with the idea of attention, our finite attention,
Mm.
the way screens and the way tech and AI have impacted our ever eroding capacities for focus, right, and engagement. And so I think that I unwittingly created the ultimate analog experience with street books. It's not that our patrons don't sometimes have cell phones, and it's not that they're not on them, but the unique thing about this encounter with the street library is it's paperback books. It's handmade zines that are folded and often handwritten. It is tactile, physical objects, and there is such a beauty in that. I mean, and I think the small paperback book that can go in a pocket or that can go in a
Yes.
backpack, rucksack, and be light to carry, so it doesn't add to someone's burden um, too much. Those are all really important aspects of the experience. And when I bike around and see people sitting and reading paperback books, it just blows my mind. I recently was on the Max train, just people watching, and there was a kid probably in his late teens, early 20s reading a Haruki Murakami book, and I wanted to just
Mm.
run and hug him because he was standing there doing that instead of scrolling his phone. And fortunately, I did not run and hug him. That would be weirder things happen on the Max train in Portland, Oregon, but I just noticed that. And I think that I think of Zadie Smith as a beautiful
Mm.
writer who has, she's notable because of her stance against like having a phone, and which in this age weirdly is a radical thing. And she talks about getting on the train in London and looking down the car and how no one is looking up. no one, you know, and how lonesome she feels. She's not self-righteous about it. It's just kind of like, guys, like, come on, let's, you know, and she recognizes how addictive she is personality wise. We all are, I think, how she grew up on TV. So she's not opposed to ingesting media, but it's just like she makes a really powerful statement about how all of these things modify us, and we have to decide to what extent we're willing to be modified. And I think that with street books, like I said, the gift of it is the distinctly analog character and our ability standing there just to have conversations about books. And it's a pretty unlikely, it's often very cross-class, cross-race groups that gather, which for Portland, which skews kind of white, is a really, you know, is another great opportunity.
Yeah, I love like having the chance to read a physical book as well. It's a completely different experience. And what what other forms of I guess literature do you provide through street books alongside books? Do you have sort of magazines or even I guess textbooks or other things like that?
Yeah, I would say, you know, we our boxes, our box trikes are comfortably they carry like 40 to 50 titles, which is typically enough to like cover two shifts, one in Old Town and one, you know, outside of a cathedral. For example, we partner with Trinity Cathedral for a lunch that they do. And for that reason, we don't tend to carry a lot of magazines around
Mm,
or textbooks just in terms of the space that they take up. But
yeah.
that said, we take requests for those things. And so periodically we'll have an extra bag of some magazines. There's a magazine called The Sun that is popular that has beautiful black and white photography and poetry and short essays. Those kinds of things are interesting to people. National Geographic, sometimes science related things. So I think that those are typically more request based, but we do have a very strange and beautiful mix on the bike at any given time. And so sometimes there's a spontaneous donation of a book, sometimes giant, like at Riverside Shakespeare or something. And and often we find a home for it by the time we take the bike back to the garage. And so that tends to work out for itself, you know.
And since you've spent so much time with these sorts of communities, I was wondering if you had recommendations on books or on sort of media forms that allow people to gain better perspective of of communities who are facing homelessness, especially since it's not always a topic that's spoken about much.
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant way to promote my own book with
Mm,
Hodge, which is a co-written story, kind of memoir of our friendship, but also of my creating the library and meeting him, his kind of waking up in Old Town and realizing he really needs to, you know, seek stability and come into a time that is a little safer for him. And that's Loners, Loaners, the making of a street library, which I think you know, much to our relief, our patrons who are unhoused who read it gave us the thumbs up because that's the major test. Like, did we pull off this project together? And if the majority of people who read it and are experiencing houselessness say, "meh," then we're like, "crap, we failed." But we really got good support, and we were able to offer that book for sale to readers and for free to our library patrons, and that's been a very cool thing to be able to do. So I think that that's great from Hodge's perspective of navigating mental health and working his way back indoors and how difficult we make that for people, because that's for sure. I also feel like I read a book years ago that is British, and I think it's called Stuart, A Life Backwards. That was by a person who had worked in a center or in some capacity working with people who were experiencing houselessness and kind of working their way back indoors or back into some programs to support them. There's also one called Supertramp that is kind of memoirs of a person on the road that is a little more, I can't remember what year that was published, but that's sort of a classic, a ride in the rails kind of classic. And I'm this is funny. I should have come with a list in my back pocket. I can follow up and send some more resources, but you know, I would encourage people to find first person accounts over, writing about people outside. I think that that was one of my major misgivings when Hodge and I first started working on this book together was I did not want to write about other people's misery
Mm,
and profit from that,
yeah.
absorb, assume that as my story kind of thing. Fortunately, we have not gotten fabulously wealthy, so we don't have to worry about that crisis of conscience. We're still good.
um, and you've mentioned your book, and what was the process like co-writing, and how did you decide on how to sort of split both of your perspectives in the form
That's
of a book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the other things that was sort of derailing as I tried to conceive of the project was the idea of helping Hodge to reconstruct his timeline and the fact that there were just going to be major gaps. And even in my own, like I had two little kids when I started Street Books and was teaching on the side as well. And so when I looked at my own timeline, there were gaps and there were times when I just had been so strung thin doing a bunch of different things that I was not necessarily a completely reliable narrator on my own timeline. And I think what we realized was we could pull from Hodge's recollections and create a kind of list and then see what was missing and see what was necessary to try to track down. And in the end, it began to be, I messed with the structure and experimented in it. It turned into kind of a nice set of vignettes that were just a back and forth conversation. And so it begins with Hodge and it begins with him in Old Town in Portland, Oregon, looking around, realizing after being evicted from a place that he's not well mentally, considering kind of an inventory of what he's lost and what he's left behind, which are things that his brothers owned. He was sort of the last kind of keeper of these things, and then he kind of let those go as well. And so I think that it's a nice portrait of Portland, a nice portrait of the city. And what I learned from that experience was that white space is okay. When you layer vignettes together, there is a texture with those, and they begin to add a kind of, uh, take on a weight and a resonance. And the things that are missing can be filled in a way with the layering technique. And so I think that Hodge's story is very beautifully told. He's very funny. He's a very droll, you know, um, kind of dark humored guy. And I think, that was interesting too, because we worked with a guy. I approached a friend who's an editor and a publisher, and I knew him well enough to say, "Hey, Michael, I'm happy to pay you. Would you look at these pages?" And at that point, I put all the pages together that Hodge and I had written over something like 7 years, alternating our perspectives, handed it off to my friend. And I basically said, please just tell me if this is garbage. Like we'd been in it mucking around for so long, I couldn't see it anymore. And Michael, as he read, I think began to see its potential and he liked that those voices in conversation. And at some point he said, hey, don't pay me. I think I might want to publish this. Would you consider a small press? And it turned out to be a beautiful collaboration because Perfect Day Publishing is based in Portland. He does one or so very fine book a year. So it's not, something that is his main business, but it is something that he loves very much. And so that turned out to be really great. And the good thing also was Hodge was not afraid of me. I was not afraid of Hodge. So we couldn't give each other assignments and come back with them the following week because we were kind of afraid not to do it. But Michael kind of exerted this authority. And so in my case, it meant him saying when we would get together for an editing session, hey, Laura, I really, just to warn you, I cut your pieces down pretty hard this week. And I'd be like, ugh. And for Hodge sort of carried these vignettes around in his head, walked around, and his mode was editing internally so that by the time he sat down and put them down. They were really quite intact already and quite beautiful. So he got way less evisceration with the editing knife. And he even came to my defense a couple times and said, "Hey, well, that's one of my favorite parts. You can't cut that." And I would be like, "Thank you." So, so it was a really cool process. But I think Michael was able to look like, especially at Hodge's timeline, and say, "What about this? What were you doing during this time?" And Hodge would say, "Well, that's when," and it would be sometimes a very colorful, great story, but it wasn't something I was able to extract on my own. And we had a pretty good, we're longtime friends. We had a pretty good working relationship.
And and those blank spaces, those moments of like what you said, white space, I think are also, from my own experience of sort of reading, those moments are also so it kind of allows you just to take in what you have read, and those moments themselves become meaningful. The very fact that there is a gap is anything but silent. I mean, now you're currently working as an educator, and has your work as part of street books influenced or shaped your approach to teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think, I have always taught, I've always taught on the side, even when I was doing projects. And so as a result, I was an adjunct teacher at Lewis and Clark College in Portland while I was running street books. And I was able to bring my students sometimes to the library. I invited them to do assignments like going and writing, you know, observation in the city, interviewing people that they might not meet otherwise. They weren't expressly required to talk to a library patron, but often they had the opportunity to have these conversations for the first time and sit with all the things that they learned and the ways they'd come with assumptions. So those were very cool, rich experiences. And for the past couple of years, I've been working at the Attic Institute, which is a literary center in Portland. And I think that the way street books has changed my thinking is I'm constantly aware of who's missing from spaces,
Mm.
right? We saw a lot of the time, the city saying, we've convened this committee and we've got 2 spots for houseless people and we are wanting to be inclusive. And the fact was, when we would ask about that and say, well, how are you reaching these people? How do they know about this meeting? Well, that was often not thought about. Is there anything offered? Can they get bus fare? Could you offer them a lunch? Could you compensate them for their time? And that was clearly not being fully thought about. And I think it is better now than when I first started Street Books. But I think that the power of an organization like Street Books is you form this really um, tight community and can check in on each other. And you can say, hey, has the mayor really dispatched a group of people to have you heard from anyone? And they can say, no, like we haven't been reached or we haven't been approached. And so there's a kind of accountability when you know people really well. And that's relationships. That's what's required. So I think that with teaching, I try to have people read multiple perspectives. My students, I try to carve out spaces for my students to take my classes for free and pretend to pay in some cases. I teach right now at a place called Street Roots, which is a newspaper, a street newspaper. Vendors are often either living outside or are very marginally housed, kind of at the margins, and they can buy a paper for 25 cents and sell it for $1. And so there is a kind of mode for them to make a bit of money. When I stepped back from street books, which I did last summer because my dad had some health challenges, he's doing better now, thankfully. But that really clarified how busy I wanted to be in my life. And so I was there for 15 years. I feel like that was a good, raised a teenager, handed it off to 2 wonderful people that are co-directors now. But when I did that, I knew that if I did not have a regular reason to be in Old Town, I would really mourn that. And so I've been able to stay in touch with former patrons and people from the groups that I got to work with and meet. And so I teach there once a week a nonfiction life stories class. We call it life stories. And they're writing sort of vignettes based on prompts that I bring, and we're working on publishing a special issue of our writing. So that's separate from the attic. And the attic has been cool because I've been able to teach memoir, but I also teach a class I call Reclaiming Attention, which has everything to do with what we were just talking about when it comes to our focus, when it comes to attention, how engaged we can be with a text without pinging around and getting a notification and standing up and going to do something. I mean, we're all facing it, right? We're all trying to figure out how to kind of protect our attention more and to sort of maybe restore some of the quality of our thinking that was previously unmolested by all that tech offers and also all that it takes away, you know? So it's been a really cool thing. I love teaching, and that has also been, you know, a balm and a beautiful thing stepping back from street books because I certainly miss the team of librarians and patrons and that culture and that, you know, that group is the just the best in the world, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been cool though, and I think I'm pleased with how well it's going without me. It's just very clearly a needed resource, you know, and they're thriving.
You've spoken about now sort of developing that ability to see um, where missing voices are and how that gap can be filled, and how is it that we can work towards better capturing those voices, those marginalized or quieter voices through literature, through other initiatives like street books.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of our librarians, Carrie, who lived outside for a long time, and who was still living outside when I asked her if she'd work for us. She was already so good at spreading books in the area where she was living. She knew what people wanted to read, and she would, when she'd come to get her own books, she'd get some for people to take back. And she has talked about how street books gave her a hand up, not a handout, and how important it was for
Mm,
her to be seen as a collaborator, to be seen as a bright, thoughtful person, because that's what she was. And so I often think about the idea that if we know one another, it's kind of like anything is possible. And if I'm honest, early on in street books, when I set out on the bike and looked around, I realized, wow, I've really done it to myself. Like, I need to approach people that I have been trained to avert my eyes from or to just like walk a wide circle around. And what I quickly found was that barring someone really having a mental health episode, which I always give people plenty of room for, everyone that I talked to was stoked. Even if they didn't want a book, they were like grateful that I said, "How's it going today? Any interest in a book? This is Street Books. Have you heard of us?" Like just engagement in a conversation. And I think that the making eye contact with someone and saying hello and being like one positive encounter with a person against all the probable, possible negative, you know, encounters that they might have during that day is a very powerful thing to do. And I think that Street Books gave me this automatic bridge to people because it was an excuse to say hello and to say, "Hey, are you familiar with this service? How you doing? Are you connected to things in the city? Are you, you know, are you new here?" Like there were people that were very fresh to Portland and were getting their sea legs, and it was great to be able to talk to them about what was going on. So I think that that's a place like not being afraid of one another. We're so out of practice saying hello and talking to
yeah.
people after the pandemic. And this, you know, we got very used to being in these little insular worlds, very screen informed. And it's hard to make ourselves look at people and say hello. And I think I think relationships is where you start, relationships and familiarity. And when we know one another, it's very easy to say, "Hey, do you know about this meeting with the city? You should really be there and weigh in, share your perspective." Like there is a way we can be a kind of cohesive fabric, but it takes knowing one another and looking at our each other's faces and to start, I think.
That reminds me of a podcast that was recently released, I think last year, and I've forgotten the name, but it'll be in the description. And it interviews people who've experienced houselessness. It touches upon exactly what you've mentioned, the that ability to create the space for these people to voice what it voice their concerns and their opinions. And I was wondering if there's been any, I guess, pushback or skepticism about certain books or literature that people have read. Has there almost been a negative reaction at times?
Do you mean like from the patrons themselves or from the larger
Um,
public?
Both sides or either.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like when I very first started, I remember a guy, I described the project and was excited. Hey, I'm going to launch this thing in summer. And I remember him saying, "Oh, that's sweet, Laura, but you'll never see the books again." That was his
Mm,
take. And I remember thinking, well, maybe not, but maybe so. How would we know if we don't try?
yeah.
And I think that skepticism fed early responses to the project, or people were just a little bit, they were like, wait and see. But I also think one thing about street books is we've been enormously lucky with coverage. Like we've had some really nice articles written about us. We were in the New York Times. I didn't know that being above the fold in the New York Times was a big deal, but apparently it is. And we got a really beautiful profile, which was funny because I think the journalist came to cover like Seattle and Portland, West Coast libraries that have very high circulation rates. That was the initial like plan. But then he came across street books and went on a shift with one of our librarians, and it was like over. Like, what picture, there's a picture of me standing with the bike library and a patron talking. And I think that compared to any picture of someone sitting at a desk talking about library circulation, I mean, it's just like they never had a chance, right? But so we were very pleased by that. But I think that the generation of some publicity made it so that once in a while there were trolls that would write like, "Oh, great, make it even more comfortable for people to be unhoused in Portland," And I think that there was blowback about. I think once in a while it's criticism like you're just enabling people to, I guess, live outside comfortably. If anyone goes on a library shift with us, they will see that it's not comfortable or ideal in any
Mm,
way to live the way our patrons are living. And there are a range of reasons that they find themselves where they find themselves. But the largest reason is lack of affordable housing and gentrification and issues around fair housing and eviction and things like that. And so I think that we've had blowback in that way. I think I can't think of any blowback from specific patrons. There's largely been more just appreciation for the access to books and to resources. And we do, in the last couple of years, we have expanded to include Narcan when we were facing epidemic proportions of overdoses on the street level. Our librarians are trained in de-escalation, in Narcan administration, keeping themselves safe, but also, the community that they're standing in. And so I think in that way, we've had occasional naysayers from the larger public, especially people who are angry with the idea of people living outside and perceiving them as sort of sucking off the system or
mm,
something. But the patrons themselves have been hugely supportive.
and how do you see sort of the future of street books? How do you see it developing over time or changing?
Well, it's interesting. I used to think, and I still do actually, how marvelous to be rendered utterly obsolete and unneeded because everyone is inside, everyone has what they need,
Yeah.
everyone has good access to books and conversation about books, and that's key because I think we tend to think, well, as soon as someone is inside four walls and a roof, they're all set. But we see a lot of lonesomeness and disconnection and isolation person to person. And I remember sometimes early on seeing a regular guy who had been at the street library a lot and I knew had gotten into an apartment. I saw him still coming back. And I was like, dude, it was in my mind, I think I had this, you've graduated now. But then I realized, no, this is his community. These are his people. And so he came back and checked on people. He came back and still checked out books, which is something, once you're a patron, you're a lifelong patron. We're happy to find you the book and welcome you warmly when we see you again. But I think that, ideally, street books would not be a necessary service because we are
Mm,
engaged in looking after people and checking on people and talking about literature just in a better, more um, utopian system. But I think for now, we will continue to adapt to the needs on the streets, continue to bring books and conversation to people and kinship and, love, and adapt for the time to come. I think in some ways, some of the feedback I've heard from people who have followed our project and who have read our book have been like, man, you need to replicate what happens at a library shift around the world. Because if people were checking on each other and saying hello to each other around the world, this would help a lot of what ails us and repair some of the harm. And one of the cool things about street books is there are a number of programs that have been inspired by street books here in the States. And so there are several in the US, like one in Austin, Texas, Street Books ATX, one in Wisconsin called the Paperback Rider,
mm,
RIDER. There's one in Poland. There was a project in Australia. So there are places around the world that have reached out and that have, communicated with us and started something similar. Or there's some of solidarity notes, like we're the Kigali Women's Library Club in Rwanda, and we
mm.
want to emulate some of what you're doing. So I think that there are these impulses in different parts of the world, and that's been a very cool part, aspect to be a part of that as well.
Yeah. I mean, our conversation has made me want to, volunteer at the closest street books I can find. Unfortunately, there isn't one here, and I just really like. I'd love to like spend a day, somehow, maybe someday in the future, because it sounds like, yeah, so much fun, and yeah, yeah. I think conversation about literature is just so cool, and it really is a remedy to the sorts of things that we're experiencing in today's world, whether that's, I don't know, the rise of AI reducing attention spans like you've mentioned. And I think what you've been working towards is just so powerful, and I don't yeah, I just can't wait to see how it develops. And I mean, as you mentioned, maybe one day we won't even need it, and perhaps that utopia will eventually come true. And yeah, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It was so nice speaking with you, and I'm just so glad you had the time to yeah, speak with us.
Well, I'm so happy and honored to be here with you. And I would say come to Portland to shadow a street library shift. I know that people may need really good reasons, compelling reasons to visit the US right now, but I
Mm,
just want to tell your listeners that my hope is all is not lost. We're in a very gnarly sideways time in our country, and have not been our best selves at the federal level for some time. It's really awful. But I think that my faith is in my international friends who know us and understand that we're in a very bad time. I think it's been humbling in a really important way, maybe for the US, maybe
mm,
a time to reflect. But I do think that for listeners who would like to connect with unhoused neighbors in their cities and are a little bit uncertain about how to go about it, a book is often a really nice way in, asking, "Hey, have you, is there a book that you'd like to read? I'm going to go get some books right now, and I'd be glad to bring you something." That is powerful, and so I just would leave people with that sort of idea that a book can be a ticket in, a way in to a relationship with someone, or just a familiarity, so that that connection is made. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk about street books. If people want to learn more, they can go to streetbooks.org and kind of follow our progress there.
yeah, the excitement you feel when you speak with someone who's read the same book that you have is just unbeatable. And all of the links that you've mentioned will definitely be in the episode description. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Aska.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you.
It was nice speaking with you too. Bye.
All right, take care.
Thanks so much for tuning in this week. Join me in the next episode of Interwoven as we continue unraveling the winding threads of literature.